My name's Tom Ridge, and I can't find the play button. And I'm from TWOREDKI in Brisbane. And 2015 was a pretty awesome year for me. I got selected for my first ever conference talk. So naturally, you would have thought I would have practiced that play button. A Star Wars movie came out, and it didn't suck. And most importantly, I became a new dad for the first time. To these two beautiful little ladies. That is exactly the reaction I was looking for, so I'm really glad you came out with that. That's Chloe on the left and Ali on the right. You might see me running after them around the conference. If you see some white stuff on my shirt, I can assure you that's Ali. She's just thrown up on me. It's okay. So naturally, overnight, I've become a bit of an expert in telling stories and singing Incy Wincy Spider. But it's the stories. The stories have got me thinking about our tests, particularly. I came into Ruby from PHP and Flash, and all I could hear was red-green refactor, test-driven development, and an emphasis on those tests to drive forward our communication about what the system under test was doing and about what our code was doing. So if we place so much importance and emphasis on our test's ability to communicate with us, why do I see so many tests that look like this? Now, I showed this test to my daughter Ali, and this was her reaction. Now, you might argue that's because she's only 6 months old and she doesn't understand what code is. But I like to think it's because she was confused about this test. Because this test doesn't actually describe itself very well. It doesn't elicit important feedback about the system under test. And it doesn't present very well. It communicates poorly. So how can you guide yourself towards that refactoring if you don't understand the story being told? So today, I want to help you write tests that tell a better tale. Tests that make way, way, way more sense than an episode of Home and Away. Tests that communicate your code's intent, not only to you, but your co-workers, your developers, other people that are onboarding. I want to help you write tests that give you better feedback, particularly if you're new, so you can start to find those rough edges, those patches of friction to address during your TDD processes. So I don't do this every single time I see your tests. And I'm a dad. I've got a short attention span as it is. So the too long didn't read, or the too long didn't listen of this talk is to be more explicit. Now, I don't mean swear more. I have 2 young babies. I'd really appreciate it if you didn't. But be more explicit in your tests. Provide more context. Provide more meaning. Because explicit tests tell a better tale. So today we're going to be having a look at some testing anti-patterns. And to do that, we're going to have a look at some examples. Now, that's not saying that these examples are bad tests. They're out there powering applications. They've gone through that TDD cycle, and they're producing good quality code 9 times out of 10. The 10th time is usually me. But they don't communicate well, and that's what I'd like to address. So all of these can kind of be framed by the anti-pattern of obscure tests. And obscure tests are, by definition, tests that hide details about the system under test from the developer, and tests that don't reveal the intention of the code very well. So the first of these we're going to have a look at is too much domain-specific language. So just a quick show of hands, who here are RSpec users? Okay, so the 2 people that are using mini-tests in this room, I apologize. This is going to be an RSpec-centric talk. So here's an example of where an overusage of RSpec's domain-specific language doesn't provide much clarity. Because RSpec's really great. It gives us all these really nice tools like befores, lets, and subjects. But we can have this tendency to overuse them, this tendency to pull them in this kind of weird desire to dry up or clear up untested code. Because that's what our test code is. It's untested test code. In this example, our subject's referencing our let, And our before block, we were referencing an external third-party GEMS API, all for one test. So I'd put it to you that this is much, much clearer and provides better context and better readability. I don't have to navigate around this file to actually understand how my dependencies and my structure is coming together. In this case, I've provided a little bit more clarity at the cost of not using those lets. Now, there's definitely a reason why you'd want to use a let and before. But what I'd argue is that you might want to actually consider whether or not reaching for that abstraction, reaching for that tool, is worth the loss of context. There was a discussion yesterday about a lot of complicated shared setup between tests. So like we touched on before, you'd want to consider whether or not, instead of actually using it before and abstracting all that shared complicated context away, that you could just use regular plain old Ruby instead and provide an intention revealing method name, and being very explicit about the data that that setup requires. So be more explicit. Rely less on your domain-specific language in your tests. Try to reduce the amount of lets and befores and subjects that you reach for if the context of that test is important to you. So the next one we're going to look at is test that fails documentation, because good tests document well. So raise your hand if you've run this in the last week. Cool. I don't have money for it, but I would buy you a beer if I did. I would encourage you to run this more often, because I ran this on a project recently, and this was the output on one particular method I saw. If anyone can actually tell me what's going on in this, I would also buy you a beer with my imaginary money. The trouble with this is that it not only fails the documentation, but you can actually pick up that there's not a lot of effective use of context and it's to actually describe what's going on. I couldn't tell you what the logical branches in here are. Chloe couldn't either. The only accurate feedback we can get from this is that our method's probably doing a little bit too much. So I want you to compare this for a second with this. Not that way. This particular example, our contexts are much, much clearer. We can clearly identify what the logical branches in our method are. And we can clearly identify our return statements and what they might return. So be more explicit. Be careful about how your tests do or don't display themselves as documentation. And keep revisiting that as you're refactoring your code to make sure it still holds up. One of the biggest contributors to obscure tests are test data that misses context. So here we have a test. We instantiate a flight, and we're expecting flight carrier to be Qantas. So I showed this once again to Ali, and Ali was like, Dad, that's a pretty good test. Which is exactly what she could say if she could actually speak, but she's 6 months old, and I'm probably expecting a bit much of her. But the trouble with this is that it's very, very hard to determine that's actually the value of number that we care about in terms of the return value of Qantas. So providing an extra little bit of context, and by pulling that variable out, we provided at least a little bit more context between carrier number and flight carrier. In regular Ruby, we'd call this refactoring explain variable. And this works particularly well in a test context because you don't necessarily want to refactor it anymore. So be more explicit. Give your data some meaningful context. Use some intention-revealing variable names. So this is kind of a bigger subset of obscure tests, but mystery guests are one of the other biggest contributors of testing anti-patterns. So in the Rails world, fixtures are the biggest contributor to this. They're very explicit data set up in a place far, far away from your code. In this particular example as well, it's not immediately clear whether or not we actually care about the fact that the Joe task is assigned to Joe, or that it's got a sensitive activity, or that it's created by Frank. we've got all these extra data points that are potentially irrelevant to our test as well, which just introduces fragility into our test suite. So we can improve this by, at least if we have to use fixtures, assigning it to a temporary variable to give some more context within our test. But we can improve it again by using factories instead of fixtures. And now we've got a little bit more clarity about the relationships that are going on, once again, inside the test. By taking it a step further and realizing that it's only really the value of activity in tasks that we care about, and by using objects, we've reduced our data required for the test there as well. So I've called back to this example as well because an aspect DSL puzzle is a kind of choose-your-own-adventure of mystery guess. Because I have to navigate and figure out that describe class actually refers to calendar event and that we're passing in the event that's set up in the let. I barely get enough sleep as it is. I don't have the mental load to figure that out. So yeah, this talk's kind of basically a statement saying, please, for my sake, at this point in my life, improve your test, please. So be more explicit. There's this concept of fresh fixtures, pulling in stuff specific to your test inside your test. So wherever possible, pull that stuff in and inline that setup and rely less on fixtures and more on factories, or better yet, plain old objects with as little data required as possible. Implicit setup is another point of contention. And that's kind of what we've been hitting on to a large degree today. So remember this example, remember how we felt about this example? Let's improve it. In this case, our context is considerably clearer. Our return statement with our it block is considerably clearer. We can say how our event comes to be, and we can actually start to infer now how we do get that end result of 45 minutes to an hour, instead of it being really obscure. So be more explicit. Use your test as a story and pull that setup inside. Make sure your data is clear. I don't want to have to travel all around the place just to figure out what's going on. Because I really don't want to travel to here every single time I look at your test suite. So start loving your tests. Inline your test setup. Pull the stuff that you can inside that's specific to your test, because as soon as you start down that let chain, out of this desire to clean things up, you more often than not find that you start creating specific overrides for those lets inside your test, further confusing things and further increasing the cognitive load required for the developer. Use intention revealing test variable names. Explain variables are great refactoring in any case, but in tests it works particularly well. It provides meaningful context where often there isn't any. Use your it and context blocks as a really good way to bring home clear documentation. And run that aspect with the format option turned on, just to see what it looks like when you're submitting your pull requests. So this is one of our earlier examples where we pulled out how it looks when we just rendered it out with the documentation. But we can see here that our email renderer class is actually quite clear about how it actually comes to generate our routes. We've used a temporary variable with route array to actually provide some more meaningful context about how we might generate that return result. These tests have better feedback because they give you more information at hand than just a red or a green dot. They tell you about your dependencies. If you're new and you've got those instincts for refactoring, they're giving you some solid data points to actually hook onto and use as your evidence to progress forward. The story being told is a way better read. You don't have to think as much. You don't have to look all around the place. You've got a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you can start refactoring with confidence. Be more explicit. Because the best kind of stories are the ones that make you think, and the ones that make you start challenging the status quo. And as developers, that's what we want to do all the time. We want to start thinking about the code that's underneath the test. We want to start thinking about our dependencies. To be more explicit. Thank you.